My children interrupted me 21 times while I tried to read my husband's last will and testament. They laughed and passed notes like bored schoolchildren while I struggled through the words my Bob had written with a trembling hand. They thought I was just a grieving old woman, lost in a fog of sorrow, too weak to notice their plotting. They were wrong, because days later, when the lawyer came, I pressed a hidden button on a tiny recorder. And when I played that tape back, the smug looks on their faces turned to sheer panic as they heard their own greedy words fill the silent room. This is the story of how I fought to save my husband's soul from the very people who should have cherished it most. It's a hard story to tell. Before we go any further, I'd love to know where you're listening from. Tell me what city or country you're in and what time it is for you. It helps me to know I'm not just talking into the void. Now, let me take you back. The silence was the hardest part after Bob was gone. For 45 years, this little cabin, nestled deep in the Blue Ridge Mountains of North Carolina, had been filled with his presence. It was in the low hum of his woodworking tools from the barn, the cheerful whistle as he tended his vegetable garden, the sound of his heavy boots on the porch. Now there was only the whisper of the wind through the tall pines and the hollow ache in my chest. He'd been gone 2 weeks, and the quiet was a physical weight, pressing down on me, suffocating me. Bob loved these mountains. He said they had a soul, an ancient wisdom in the misty peaks and the deep, shaded hollows. He knew every creek, every deer trail, every hawk's nest. He'd built this house with his own 2 hands, felling the timber from our own land, fitting each log with a lover's care. "This isn't just a house, Ellie," he'd always say, his hand warm on mine. "It's our legacy. It's made of us." I was sitting on the porch swing he'd built, a cold cup of coffee in my hands, when my son Ethan's rental car crunched up the gravel driveway. He stepped out, already on his phone, a sleek black rectangle pressed to his ear. He was a financial consultant from Charlotte, and he always looked impatient, as if the slow, steady rhythm of the mountains was an inconvenience he had to tolerate. He ended his call with a sharp, "I'll circle back on the quarterly projections," and gave me a quick, sterile hug. "Hey, Mom, just came to help you get organized. You shouldn't be dealing with all this alone." His version of getting organized, I soon discovered, was to triage our life together into 2 piles: things with monetary value and things without. He started in the den, Bob's favorite room. It still smelled of him: cedar, old books, and the faint scent of the pipe tobacco he only smoked on special occasions. Ethan's eyes scanned the room, not with sentiment, but with the cold appraisal of an auctioneer. He went straight to the corner where Bob kept his fly fishing gear. The custom-made rods, the hand-tied flies in their neat wooden boxes, the worn wicker creel, each piece held a story, a memory of a sun-drenched afternoon by the river. He picked up a beautiful bamboo rod, a gift I'd saved for months to buy him for his 50th birthday. He turned it over in his hands. "You know, some of this vintage stuff can fetch a decent price on eBay. Could probably get a few $100 for the lot." I stared at him, my heart suddenly cold. A few $100. He was pricing out his father's joy, his passion, his quiet moments of peace. He was trying to sell the memory of the sun on the water. That dismissive gesture, that cold question, it was the first crack in the dam of my grief. But I had no idea a flood of betrayal was about to pour through. I didn't answer him. I couldn't. I just stood there, clutching my coffee cup, and watched my son, the little boy I taught to tie his shoes, the teenager I helped with his homework, reduce his father's life to a balance sheet. He saw my silence and seemed to take it as agreement, making a neat pile of the fishing gear to be processed later. That became the theme of the week. My daughter, Madison, a brand marketing director from Atlanta, arrived the next day, and together they were a tag team of heartless efficiency. The phone calls started. They would walk out onto the porch, their voices low and urgent, thinking I couldn't hear them through the screen door. But in the mountain quiet, voices carry. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop, but their words found me anyway. "The appraisal on the acreage came in higher than we thought, Ethan," I heard Madison say one afternoon, her voice sharp with excitement. "The key is unlocking the intrinsic value. We can't just let it sit there." "Sit there?" I thought, Bob's forest wasn't just sitting there, it was living, breathing. It was home to owls and black bears and 100-year-old oak trees. It was the lungs of this mountain. Another time, I heard Ethan on the phone with, I assume, a business partner. It's a legacy asset, but it's grossly underutilized, he said, the corporate jargon dripping from his tongue. We need to be aggressive with the estate planning to maximize the return for the beneficiaries. Beneficiaries. Not family, not your grieving mother. We were just names on a document, obstacles on the path to profit. I tried to talk to them about their father. I mentioned how he wanted to clear a new path down to the waterfall. Madison just nodded, her eyes distant, probably visualizing where a scenic overlook for a commercial property would go. I mentioned that Bob had left 2 wills. There's the formal one, of course, the one with the lawyer, Miss Davis, but he also wrote a letter, a personal one. He was very specific that he wanted me to read it to you both, here in this room before we did anything else. Ethan exchanged a look with Madison. It was a fleeting glance, but it was filled with a shared, wearied patience, the kind you'd give a difficult child. Of course, Mom, Madison said, her voice smooth as silk. We want to honor Dad, but we also have to be practical. He was a sentimental man, but he was also a smart one. He would want us to secure the family's financial future. Their words were a smokescreen. They spoke of honoring him, while their actions screamed of desecrating everything he stood for. Bob valued integrity, hard work, the quiet beauty of the natural world. He believed a man's wealth was measured by the love he gave and the respect he earned, not the size of his bank account. My children, it seemed, had forgotten every lesson he had ever taught them. They had been raised in these mountains, under the shade of these same trees, but they had somehow grown into people their father would not even recognize. The day for the will reading was set. They were practically vibrating with anticipation, their talk filled with numbers and projections. They saw deeds and dollar signs. I saw the ghost of my husband, his disappointment a palpable presence in the room.
They were flying in for the reading of the will, they said, but I knew they weren't coming to mourn their father. They were coming to liquidate his memory. The morning of the will reading, my living room, usually a cozy space filled with handmade quilts and the scent of beeswax, was transformed. Madison had brought a sleek silver laptop, and her husband, Liam, a man with a perpetually smug expression and a vocabulary consisting mostly of business school buzzwords, was hooking it up to my small television. Ethan was arranging 3 stark modern chairs he'd brought in from the porch, facing the TV like it was a boardroom screen. The air crackled with a strange corporate energy that felt utterly alien in my home. "Okay, Mom," Madison said, patting the armchair next to her. "Before we get into the formalities of the will, we wanted to walk you through a vision, something to honor Dad's legacy and also provide you with total financial security for the rest of your life." A vision. My heart sank. I knew this wouldn't be about preserving Bob's memory, but about rebranding it. Liam clicked a button, and the screen lit up with a logo, a stylized mountain peak with the words Blue Ridge Summit Retreats in a cold, minimalist font. My stomach churned. They hadn't even used our family name. For the next 20 minutes, they subjected me to a full-scale business pitch. Madison's voice was polished and persuasive, the voice she used to sell luxury skincare to wealthy women. She spoke of wellness tourism, curated experiences, and optimizing the guest journey. Ethan chimed in with talk of zoning variances, Phase 1 investment, and projected ROI. Then came the images, architectural renderings of what they planned to do to our home. They showed minimalist glass and steel cabins dotted throughout Bob's forest, the one he'd so carefully managed for decades. They showed a yoga pavilion where his workshop, his sanctuary, now stood. They showed a sleek spa with an infinity pool overlooking the very cliff where Bob and I had watched countless sunsets, where he had proposed to me 50 years ago. It was a desecration. They were planning to pave over our life together and charge people $1,000 a night to sleep on the rubble. They talked about the land not as a home, but as a plot. They talked about the ancient trees not as living beings, but as inventory that would need to be selectively cleared to open up the views. Liam, the self-appointed expert, pointed at the screen. "Ellie," he said, calling me by my first name as if we were colleagues. "The key demographic we're targeting, Ellie, is the high net worth individual seeking an authentic, rustic luxury escape. We leverage the existing narrative of the location, the craftsman's mountain home, and monetize it." Monetize it. The phrase echoed in the quiet room. Monetize my husband's sweat and skill. Monetize my love and my grief. I looked at their faces, bright with excitement and ambition. They were so proud of their soulless, greedy plan. They weren't just erasing Bob. They were packaging his ghost and selling it to the highest bidder. They saw no sacrilege in turning our sacred spaces into commercial ones. The old-growth forest, the workshop filled with the scent of sawdust and dreams, the port swing where we'd whispered secrets, it was all just real estate to them. It was all just a commodity. They finished their presentation and looked at me, a triumphant gleam in their eyes, clearly expecting me to be impressed, perhaps even grateful. They saw my stunned silence as awe at their brilliance. They finished their presentation and looked at me, expecting applause. What they got was silence, and in that silence, I made a decision. They had declared war. They just didn't know I was already planning my defense. The silence in the room grew heavy, broken only by the hum of the laptop. Madison's smile faltered slightly. "So, what do you think, Mom? It's a game changer, right? You'd never have to worry about money or the upkeep of this old place again?" The burden of this old place, as if my life here, woven into the very fabric of this land, had been a chore, as if my peace hadn't been shattered the moment they decided to turn their grief into a business proposal. I finally found my voice, though it was little more than a whisper. Your father loved this place as it is." Ethan let out a short, impatient sigh. It was a sound I was beginning to know well. "Mom, Dad was a practical man. He never liked to see an asset underutilized. This isn't about changing things, it's about improving them. It's the smart move." He then reached into his leather briefcase and pulled out a thick sheaf of papers, bound in a neat blue cover. He slid it across the polished surface of the dining table, the same table where we'd shared thousands of family meals, where I'd helped them with their homework, where Bob had sat at the head for 45 years. The document stopped right in front of me. The title on the cover page was printed in bold, official-looking letters. "Power of Attorney and Estate Management Agreement." My blood ran cold. I didn't need to be a lawyer to understand what I was looking at. "This is just a formality," Ethan said quickly, his tone attempting to be reassuring but failing miserably. "It just makes things more efficient. It gives us, Madison and me, the ability to make the necessary executive decisions regarding the estate's assets. You know, to handle the rezoning applications, secure the initial investors, that sort of thing. It's a standard agreement." I slowly opened the cover. My eyes scanned the dense legal text, the words blurring together until a few phrases jumped out at me. "Giving hereby grants Ethan Blackwood and Madison Blackwood Hayes controlling interest in authority to liquidate, consolidate, or leverage any and all real estate assets, well as a 70% majority share in all decisions." 70%. They were writing me out of my own life, demoting me to a minority shareholder in the home my husband built for me? There at the bottom of the last page was my full name, Eleanor May Blackwood, typed neatly above a dotted line, waiting patiently for my signature. The pen was already lying beside it. I looked up from the paper and met their expectant eyes. Madison was smiling that bright, persuasive smile she used in her marketing campaigns. Ethan was leaning forward, his expression of earnest, helpful concern. It was a breathtaking charade. They had rehearsed this. They had planned it all, from the polished presentation to this final, decisive move. They thought they had cornered me, that my grief had made me weak and pliable. They thought I would just sign it, grateful that they were taking this burden off my shoulders. I didn't say a word. I just stared at the document, at the pen, at their eager faces. The air was thick with their unspoken assumptions. Then, slowly, deliberately, I pushed my chair back from the table. I stood up, walked into the adjoining sunroom, and gently closed the French doors behind me, leaving them alone with their proposal and their greed. They mistook my silence for surrender. They had no idea it was the calm before the storm I was about to unleash.
My quiet retreat to the sunroom seemed to unnerve them. They had expected a fight, or tears, or a weary signature. My silent withdrawal was not in their script. They left me alone for the rest of the day, speaking in hushed tones in the other room, no doubt recalibrating their strategy. I sat in Bob's old wicker chair, watching the sun dip below the mountains, and felt a cold, hard resolve settle deep in my bones. The grief was still there, a constant ache, but now it was joined by something else, the fierce, protective instinct of a woman defending her home. The next morning, they approached me with a new tactic. It was Madison who spoke, her voice oozing with synthetic concern. "Mom, Ethan and I were talking last night and, well, we're worried about you." I raised an eyebrow. "Worried?" "You've been through so much," she continued, placing a hand on my arm. "It's a tremendous amount of stress. We feel you shouldn't have to carry it all alone. So we took the liberty of arranging for someone to talk to, a professional." Before I could protest, the doorbell rang, as it's on cue. Ethan opened it to reveal a woman in her late 50s, dressed in a severe gray pantsuit with a tight smile and cold, assessing eyes. "Ethan, this is Dr. Miller," Ethan said, ushering her in. "She's a grief counselor. She was kind enough to drive all the way up here to have a little chat." Dr. Miller. She didn't look like any grief counselor I ever saw. She had the brisk, impersonal air of a corporate auditor. She shook my hand, her grip firm and dry. They led us to the living room, and my children arranged themselves on the sofa opposite me, like a panel of judges. Dr. Miller sat next to them, pulling a notepad from her briefcase. "Eleanor," she began, her voice professional but devoid of any real warmth. "Your children have expressed some concern about your well-being during this difficult transition. It's completely normal to feel overwhelmed after such a significant loss." I nodded, waiting. Her questions started innocently enough. "How have you been sleeping? Are you eating properly?" But then they took a sharp turn. "Do you find yourself feeling confused by financial or legal documents? Do you feel that managing a large property like this is becoming a source of anxiety for you? Sometimes our emotional state can cloud our judgment in practical matters, wouldn't you agree?" Every question was a subtle probe, a gentle insinuation designed to paint me as incompetent. She wasn't there to help me process my grief. She was there to build a case against my state of mind. They hadn't hired a therapist, they'd hired a hired gun. This was their new strategy. If I wouldn't willingly sign over control, they would try to create a record that suggested I wasn't fit to have it in the first place. The audacity of it, the cold, clinical cruelty of it took my breath away. They would use my love for their father, my sorrow at his passing, as a weapon against me. I looked at Ethan and Madison, their faces masks of filial concern, and I felt a surge of anger so pure and so cold, it was almost calming. They had underestimated me completely. I turned my full attention to Dr. Miller. I smiled, a small, tight smile. "Doctor," I said, my voice even,
My husband and I managed this large property for 45 years. I handled all of our household finances. I am perfectly lucid. My only source of anxiety right now, in fact, is this conversation. Thank you for your time, but your services will not be required. I stood up, ending the interview. The mask of concern on my children's faces dissolved into frustration. Dr. Miller, ever the professional, simply packed her briefcase and left. As I watched her car disappear down the driveway, I knew the battle lines had been irrevocably drawn. I knew I couldn't just resist them anymore. I had to beat them. That was their biggest mistake. They didn't just question my decisions anymore, they questioned my sanity. And they gave me the motivation I needed to stop playing defense and start fighting back. After the disastrous visit from the grief counselor, a tense quiet settled over the house. My children avoided me, communicating with each other through text messages and pointed looks. They knew their little scheme had failed, and it had only hardened my resolve. The following day was the one we had set aside for me to read Bob's letter aloud, as he had wished. I think, at this point, they saw it as nothing more than a sentimental hurdle to clear before they could get back to their real business. They had no idea I was counting. We gathered in the living room. I sat in Bob's one leather air chair, the one with the permanent impression of his shoulders. In my hands, I held the single-page letter he had penned in the final weeks of his life. The paper was thick and creamy, his handwriting shaky but resolute. Ethan and Madison sat opposite me, their impatience a palpable force in the room. I took a deep breath, the scent of old leather and wood smoke filling my lungs, and began to read. My dearest Ellie, Ethan, and Madison, if you are reading this, it means my time in these beautiful mountains has come to an end. Before you go on, Mom, Ethan cut in, holding up a hand. That was interruption number 1. Just to clarify, did Dad write this himself, or did Miss Davis help with the legal phrasing? This is entirely your father's, I said, my eyes fixed on the page. I tried to find my place again. I have loved this life, and I have loved all of you more than these words can say. This home, this land, it is the story of our family. Speaking of the land, Madison interjected, her phone already in her hand. That was number 2. I was just looking at the county zoning maps. Is the forested acreage designated for conservation or residential use? That has major tax implications. Madison, please, I said, my patience beginning to fray. I continued reading about his hopes for us, about the values he held dear. He wrote about integrity, about kindness, about leaving the world a little better than we found it. Each sentence was a piece of his heart, and each one was met with an interruption. 3. What's the estimated value of the timber on the north-facing slope? From Ethan. 4. Did he update his life insurance policy after he got sick? From Madison. 5. Does the term irrevocable trust that Ms. Davis mentioned apply to the physical house itself or just the financial assets? They kept coming, a relentless barrage of questions about capital gains, property lines, and market value. They weren't hearing his words, they were scouting for loopholes. They weren't hearing his love, they were calculating their inheritance. I counted each one, not on paper, but in my soul. Each interruption was a chisel, chipping away at the sanctity of the moment their father had envisioned. They whispered to each other. They tapped on their laptops. They looked at their watches. Number 12 was when Liam, the son-in-law, actually snorted when I read Bob's line about how true wealth is a walk in the woods at sunrise. Number 17 was when Madison stopped me to ask if the antique furniture had been recently appraised.
By the time I reached the 21st interruption, a question from Ethan about whether the mineral rights were included with the deed, something inside me snapped. Not with anger, but with a profound, chilling clarity. They had no intention of honoring anything. This wasn't a reading. It was a hostile cross-examination of their father's soul. I looked up from the page at their faces. Ethan was
idly tapping a pen against his chin, Madison was discreetly scrolling through her phone beneath the table. They were completely, utterly detached. I quietly folded the letter and placed it back in its envelope. "We're done," I said. "But you didn't finish," Madison said, looking up, feigning surprise. "Oh, I'm finished," I replied, my voice dangerously calm. I stood up. "The official reading with Miss Davis is tomorrow. I expect you to be on time." When I finished, I quietly folded the letter. They thought they had won. They thought they had worn me down, but as I walked upstairs, I wasn't defeated. I was armed. Now, before I tell you what I did next, I have to pause and ask you, if you were in my shoes, what would you have done? After being dismissed and disrespected like that, by your own children, how would you have reacted? Let me know in the comments. I truly want to know. That night, I didn't sleep. I lay in the big bed that suddenly felt cavernous without Bob in it, and I didn't cry. The anger had burned away the tears, leaving only a cold, hard resolve. They thought they were dealing with a fragile old woman. They thought my grief was a weakness they could exploit. But grief is a funny thing. It hollows you out, but sometimes it fills that hollow space with steel. Long after the house was dark and quiet, I slipped out of bed. I went not to the living room or the kitchen, but to the place that was most sacred to Bob, his workshop in the barn. The air inside was thick with the comforting smell of sawdust and varnish. His tools hung in their perfect places on the pegboard wall, each one cleaned and oiled. His half-finished projects sat on the workbench, a birdhouse for the wrens, a carved walking stick. It felt like he had just stepped out for a moment. I went to his bookshelf, a wobbly thing he'd built himself decades ago. I ran my fingers along the spines of his favorite books, collections of poetry, biographies of woodsmen, and worn field guides. I pulled out a thick, hollowed-out copy of Walden by Henry David Thoreau, a book he often read from aloud to me. Tucked inside wasn't a flask of whiskey or a secret stash of cash. It was something far more valuable to me in that moment. It was a small, high-fidelity, digital audio recorder. Bob had used it for his birdwatching. He'd spend hours in the forest, perfectly still, recording the calls of warblers and thrushes. It was a powerful little device, sensitive enough to pick up the faintest whisper of a wing. I checked the battery. It was still good. The memory card was nearly empty. With silent, deliberate movements, I slipped it into the pocket of my cardigan. It was no bigger than a pack of gum. It was my secret weapon. They had come armed with spreadsheets and lawyers' jargon. I would come armed with the truth. The next morning, I was the first one downstairs. I made a pot of coffee and waited. I was calm. It was the kind of calm that comes when you know exactly what you have to do, no matter how difficult. My children came down, dressed in sharp business casual attire, ready for what they clearly saw as the final negotiation. Miss Evelyn Davis, the lawyer, was scheduled to arrive at 10 o'clock sharp. Just before she was due, I went to the dining room table where we were to meet. I took a linen napkin, folded it into a loose triangle, and placed it next to my water glass. With my back to the doorway, I took the small recorder from my pocket, switched it on, and nestled it underneath the napkin. The tiny microphone was aimed perfectly at the center of the table. The doorbell rang. Ethan opened it to welcome Miss Davis. As they all sat down, arranging their papers and their expressions of somber respectability, I took a slow sip of water. I could feel the small, solid weight of the recorder in my pocket earlier, and now I could feel the invisible web of its hearing, capturing every sigh, every rustle of paper, every word. The stage was set, the actors were in place, and the secret audience, my little digital recorder, was listening to every single word. Miss Evelyn Davis was a woman in her late 60s with intelligent eyes and an air of unflappable calm. She'd been our family lawyer for 30 years. She'd handled the purchase of this land, helped my husband set up his small woodworking business, and most importantly, she had known and respected my husband. She greeted Ethan and Madison with a polite but distant nod before taking my hand in both of hers, a small gesture of quiet solidarity that did not go unnoticed by my children. She opened her briefcase and began, her voice clear and firm, leaving no room for interpretation. Good morning. We are here for the official reading of Robert Blackwood's last will and testament, filed and confirmed with the state of North Carolina. The will is legally ironclad. She stated that Bob's will established an irrevocable trust. She explained the term with painstaking clarity. This means the terms laid out by Mr. Blackwood are final and cannot be modified, amended, or contested by the beneficiaries. I saw Ethan's jaw clench. Madison crossed her arms, her composure cracking just a little. Let me be clear, she continued, looking directly at my son. The purpose of an irrevocable trust is to ensure the grantor's wishes are carried out precisely as he intended, without external pressure or subsequent changes of heart. Ethan couldn't help himself. He tried to interrupt. Miss Davis, regarding the flexibility of the asset allocation, she silenced him with her raised finger and a look that could freeze fire. There is no flexibility, Mr. Blackwood. That is the very definition of irrevocable. Please do not interrupt me again. The room was silent. The hidden recorder drank it all in. Miss Davis then laid out the terms. First, the house and the immediate 10 acres of surrounding grounds, including the workshop, are to remain in Eleanor's name for the duration of her life. She has sole and exclusive rights to the property to live in as she sees fit. She paused, letting the words land. Upon her passing, the house and its grounds are to be passed to her granddaughter, Sophia Blackwood. Sophia. The name hung in the air. She was the daughter of my eldest child, Lily, who we had lost to cancer 5 years ago. My children had conveniently forgotten about their niece. The remaining acreage and all financial assets, including investment portfolios and bank accounts, are to be split equally among his 3 children. She looked pointedly at Ethan and Madison. That means 1/3 for you, Ethan, 1/3 for you, Madison, and 1/3 to be held in trust for Sophia until she reaches the age of 25.
Furthermore, Miss Davis said, a faint smile touching her lips for the first time, Robert established a significant memorial scholarship in his name at the local community college for students pursuing trades like carpentry and environmental science. He funded it with his life insurance policy. A wave of love and sorrow washed over me so potent it stole my breath. That was my Bob, always thinking of others, always trying to build something good. It was a part of his will that was completely new to me, a final, beautiful gift. Ethan, desperate, made one last attempt. Could the property assets be consolidated into a family LLC for more efficient management? He asked, his voice strained. The will is final, Miss Davis repeated, her tone unwavering. Sloan produced a printout of their Blue Ridge Summit Retreat's pitch. Could the trust be leveraged to fund the initial renovations? No, Miss Davis said flatly, not without the unanimous consent of all beneficiaries, which includes Sophia's legal guardian and the trustee appointed to manage her funds. The will is designed specifically to prevent the leveraging of these assets for high-risk business ventures. That was it, the final nail in the coffin of their predatory dream. They fell silent, their faces masks of fury and resentment. Their faces fell. The easy victory they had imagined was slipping through their fingers, but the worst for them was yet to come. After Miss Davis left, a toxic silence filled the house. My children didn't look at me. They stared out the windows, at the trees they could no longer cut down, at the land they could no longer exploit.
Their entitlement had slammed headfirst into the solid wall of their father's love and foresight. They saw it as a betrayal. I saw it as this final act of protection. They left that afternoon, mumbling excuses about needing to get back to work. The relief I felt when their car disappeared down the driveway was immense. The house sighed and settled back into its peaceful quiet, but I knew this wasn't over. They were furious, and people like Ethan and Madison don't give up easily. They would find another angle, another way to pressure me or to try and influence their niece's guardian. I had won the battle, but the war for my husband's legacy was still on. I had to fortify my position. That evening, I sat at Bob's roll-top desk, the little digital recorder connected to my laptop. I listened to the entire recording of the meeting with Miss Davis, but that wasn't the file I was interested in. I had another recording, one I had made on my phone during the disastrous reading of Bob's letter, the one with the 21 interruptions. I saved the file, labeling it simply, The Reading. My hands were steady as I composed a new email, my first call to arms. The recipient was my sister-in-law, Bob's younger sister, Carol. Carol was a no-nonsense rancher from western North Carolina who valued integrity above all else. More importantly, she was Sophia's legal guardian. I wrote, Dearest Carol, I hope this finds you well. Things here have been difficult. The official will reading has taken place. I've attached a summary of the terms from Miss Davis. However, I feel you need more context to understand the situation fully. Please listen to the attached audio file. It's a recording of an informal reading I held the day before. Let's speak after you've had a chance to listen. All my love, Ellie. I attached the file, the 21 insults, and hit send. My second email was to Mr. Harrison, the man Bob had appointed as the trustee for Sophia's inheritance. He was a retired accountant and an old fishing buddy of Bob's, a man whose honesty was as solid as the mountains themselves. I sent him the same message with the same attachment. I was building my army, an army armed not with lawyers and spreadsheets, but with the simple, undeniable truth of my children's character. I was giving my allies the evidence they needed to see what I saw, to understand the nature of the people they would soon be dealing with. This wasn't about being vindictive. This was about protection. I was protecting Sophia's future from her uncle and aunt's greed, and I was protecting my own peace of mind. I didn't have to wait long. Within the hour, my phone rang. It was Carol. I could hear the cold fury in her voice, a fury that mirrored my own. Ellie, I just listened to it. All of 27 minutes of it, she said, her voice tight. Those goddamn vultures. They didn't even let you finish a sentence. Don't you worry about a thing. They won't get a damn thing past me or that girl. Any proposal, any request, any idea they have will have to go through me, and the answer will be no. A wave of relief washed over me. I was not alone in this fight. Mr. Harrison called shortly after, his voice laced with a quiet, steely anger. He informed me that he would be documenting the audio file as a potential attempt at coercive control over the estate and would be on high alert for any unusual financial propositions. Within an hour, my phone rang. It was Carol. I could hear the fury in her voice. Those vultures, Ellie. Don't you worry. They won't get another dime past us. My army was growing. My children were oblivious to the storm I was gathering. They returned 2 days later, their anger having cooled into a new, more insidious strategy. They were all smiles and apologies. Mom, we're so sorry about how we acted, Madison said, giving me a hug that felt like a business transaction. We were just stressed and emotional. We want to work with you on this, all of us, as a family. I knew it was a lie, but I played along. I nodded and accepted their hollow apologies. They spent the day being conspicuously helpful, fixing a leaky faucet, complimenting my cooking. It was all part of a new performance. They thought my quietness was a sign that I was coming around, that their initial defeat had softened me up for a new round of negotiation. They mistook my silence for weakness, when in reality, it was observation. I was watching their every move. That night, after I had gone up to bed, I couldn't sleep. I heard them talking downstairs in the kitchen, their voices low but carrying in the still night air. I crept to the top of the stairs and listened. I heard Ethan say, She's being more receptive, but we have to stick to the plan. Don't push too hard. Just follow the steps in the strategy deck. Madison replied, I know. Liam says phase 1 is the most critical. If we can't get her emotionally aligned, we'll never get her to see the long-term benefits of a unified management structure. Strategy deck, phase 1. The words sent a chill down my spine. I waited until I was sure they were asleep. Then, heart pounding, I slipped back downstairs. The house was dark except for the glow of a single device left on the kitchen counter. Madison's tablet. It was plugged in, charging. A long shot, I knew, but I had to look. I picked it up. It was locked with a passcode. My mind raced. What would she use? Her birthday? Too obvious. Then it hit me. I typed in the name of her pampered little poodle. Muffin123. The tablet unlocked. My fingers trembled as I navigated through her files. It didn't take long to find it. A folder labeled Blackwood Estate. Inside was a PowerPoint presentation. The file name was LegacyTransitionStrategy.pptx.
I opened it. It was their business plan, but with more detail. I scrolled through slides about financial projections and marketing angles, and then I saw it. A slide titled Stakeholder Management, EB. EB, Eleanor Blackwood, me. Beneath the title were bullet points. Initial approach. Emphasize financial security and reduced burden. If resistance encountered, pivot to emotional concern. Engage third-party professional to validate claims of cognitive overload. Phase 1, maternal pacification. Goal, reestablish trust through consistent positive reinforcement. De-escalate conflict and foster environment of collaboration. Isolate from uncooperative external influences, C and H. Phase 2, introduce concept of unified family LLC as a protection for her and Sophia. Phase 3, secure consent and proceed with development. Maternal pacification. The phrase was so cold, so clinical. It felt like a physical blow. They had a literal, step-by-step plan to handle me, to manage my emotions, to pacify me like a crying baby until I gave them what they wanted. And they had even identified my allies, Carol and Mr. Harrison, as uncooperative influences to be isolated. This wasn't just greed anymore. This was a calculated psychological campaign. It was the most profoundly disrespectful thing I had ever seen. I didn't break down. I didn't get angry. A strange, icy calm washed over me. I took out my phone, took a clear picture of the screen, and emailed it to Carol and Mr. Harrison. The subject line was one word: proof. Now, I wasn't just fighting for Bob's memory. I was fighting for my own dignity. The discovery of that strategy deck changed everything. The fight was no longer just about a piece of land or a sum of money. It was about my identity as a thinking, feeling human being, not a stakeholder to be pacified. My grief, which had been a heavy shroud, was now a lens, bringing the world into sharp, unforgiving focus. I needed to feel close to Bob. I needed to be reminded of the man I was fighting for, not the asset my children were fighting over. So I went up to the attic, a place I hadn't been since before he got sick. The air was cool and smelled of old paper and cedar. In a dusty corner under an old patchwork quilt was a heavy wooden chest, his memory chest. I lifted the lid. Inside, it wasn't filled with stock certificates or property deeds. It was filled with him. Old photographs, letters I had written to him when we were first dating, his father's pocket watch,
and beneath it all, a stack of worn, leather-bound journals. I took them downstairs and sat in his favorite chair, the one that still held his shape. I spent the rest of the day reading. For hours, I lost myself in his strong, familiar handwriting. He wrote about the changing seasons in the mountains, about the day he finally spotted a rare, pileated woodpecker, about his frustration with a tricky dovetail joint on a cabinet he was building. But then I found the entries from the last few years of his life. And what I read on those faded, ink-filled pages was his real last will and testament. He hadn't written about profit or market value. He had written about purpose. He had sketched out detailed plans for a small, free community workshop in his barn. He wanted to teach local kids, especially troubled ones, the joy of woodworking. He had lists of tools to acquire, simple projects to start with, even the names of a few retired friends he wanted to ask to help him run it. To give a young person a skill is to give them a future. It's better than any handout. And there was more. He had written about the forest, his beloved forest. He had mapped out walking trails. He had drafted a letter to the local school board offering to lead guided nature walks for school children. He wanted to preserve the old-growth section as a permanent nature sanctuary, a place where future generations could learn about the wild, beautiful world. His legacy wasn't about building a luxury retreat for the wealthy. It was about building a stronger community for everyone. It was a legacy of service, not sales. Tears streamed down my face as I read his words, but they weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of love, of pride, of profound understanding. My children, with all their business degrees and marketing plans, had completely missed the point of their father's life. They had seen his land and only saw its potential for profit. Bob had seen his land and only saw its potential for good. I closed the final journal, my heart full. The path forward was no longer foggy. It was a clear, well-lit trail, and my husband had drawn the map for me himself. They thought they were in a battle for his money. I was in a battle for his soul. Tears streamed down my face as I read his words. My children wanted to build a retreat for the rich. My husband wanted to build a sanctuary for the community. And right then, I knew exactly what I had to do. By the way, if you've been listening this far, thank you. It means a lot to know you're still with me on this journey. If you are, do me a favor and just comment with the number 1 so I know you're here. Okay, let's get to the final showdown. Armed with Bob's journals and the unwavering support of my allies, I was ready. I called Ethan and Madison. "I'd like you both to come for dinner on Saturday," I said, my voice intentionally warm and conciliatory. "Your father wouldn't have wanted us to be fighting like this. It's time we moved forward as a family." The relief in their voices was palpable. They heard "move forward" and immediately translated it to "move forward with our plan." They saw it as my final surrender. They arrived on Saturday evening, radiating a smug, victorious energy. Madison had brought an expensive bottle of wine. Ethan presented me with a bouquet of lilies, the same flowers we'd had at Bob's funeral. The irony was so thick I could have choked on it. They were celebrating a victory they hadn't even won yet. They had prepared for this dinner as if it were a closing ceremony. They spoke glowingly about the future, about how the Blue Ridge Summit retreats would become a premier destination. They talked about the press it would generate, the accolades it would win. They were already spending the money in their heads. I let them talk. I served the roast chicken, Bob's favorite, and refilled their wine glasses. I played the part of the pacified mother perfectly, nodding and smiling at all the right moments. They mistook my composure for compliance. After the main course, as I served the apple pie made from the trees Bob planted himself, Ethan cleared his throat. It was time for the final pitch. "Mom," he began, his tone a perfect blend of respect and authority, "we are so glad you see the potential here. We've put together a final proposal. A family LLC. We'll all be partners. You'll have a generous lifelong stipend, completely tax-free, and you'll never have to worry about a single bill or repair again. We handle everything. All it requires is your signature to create the new corporate structure." Madison passed out glossy brochures, professionally printed, filled with the same cold architectural renderings and empty marketing phrases. They spoke of revenue streams and brand synergy. They spoke of everything but their father.
They finally finished, their voices echoing in the warm dining room. The silence that followed was thick with their smug expectation. They looked at me, pens ready, smiles plastered on their faces, waiting for me to sign my life away. I let the silence stretch out, enjoying the look of confusion that started to creep into their eyes. I took a slow sip of water. I folded my hands on the table, and then I stood up. My heart was a steady drum against my ribs. There was no fear, no anger, just the profound, quiet strength that comes from knowing you are doing the right thing. I looked from my son's stunned face to my daughter's. I smiled, a real smile for the first time in weeks. "Your presentation is very impressive," I began, my voice clear and steady. "But it's completely irrelevant." The smiles vanished from their faces. Ethan's jaw went slack. Madison stared at me, her eyes wide with disbelief. What do you mean, irrelevant?" she stammered. "I mean," I said, my voice ringing with a clarity that surprised even me, "that your plans for this land, for this home, for your father's memory are null and void. They are a fantasy, because you cannot build on, develop, or sell land that you do not control." Ethan scoffed, a flicker of his old arrogance returning. "Mom, we've been over this. The will is clear. We are all beneficiaries. We have a right to—" "You have a right to your monetary inheritance," I cut him off, my voice sharp as broken glass. "And you will receive every penny of it, exactly as your father dictated. But the land is another story. The soul of this place, the part of your father you sought to desecrate and sell, is now beyond your reach." I walked over to Bob's old sideboard and picked up a thick manila envelope. I pulled out a legal document and placed it on the table in front of them. "As you know," I continued, enjoying the moment, "your father's will required the unanimous consent of all beneficiaries or their legal guardians for any major decisions regarding the real estate assets. You needed my consent, and you needed the consent of Sophia's guardian, Aunt Carol, and her trustee, Mr. Harrison." I let that sink in. "What you didn't seem to understand is that we have been communicating, all of us. We have reviewed your proposals. We have listened to your methods." I looked them dead in the eye. "We have even read your strategy memos about maternal pacification." The last bit of color drained from Madison's face. She looked like she'd been struck. "And we, as a majority, have made a decision. A unanimous one. As of this morning, the deed to the entire forested acreage, the barn, and the workshop has been legally transferred into a newly established charitable foundation." I paused, letting the words hang in the air like smoke. "It is called the Robert Blackwood Memorial Foundation for Community Craft and Conservation. Its mission, legally binding and permanent, is to fulfill your father's final wishes, the ones he wrote about in his journals. It will operate a free woodworking shop for local youth in the barn and preserve the forest as a nature sanctuary for local schools. It will be managed by a board, which includes Mr. Harrison, Aunt Carol, and myself. It is protected, it is permanent, and it is not for sale. Checkmate. The room was utterly silent. The candles flickered, casting long dancing shadows on their stricken faces. All their plans, their charts, their schemes, all turned to dust in a single moment. They hadn't been in a negotiation with a grieving widow. They had been in a chess match with a queen who was protecting her father's legacy, and they had just been soundly defeated. Ethan's face went pale. Madison's mouth opened, but no words came out. They looked at me, finally seeing not a grieving old woman, but the guardian of her father's soul. They didn't shout, they didn't argue. They were too stunned for that. The polished corporate armor they wore had been shattered, and what was left underneath was ugly and small. Ethan just stared at the document on the table as if it were a snake. Madison slowly pushed her chair back, her movements stiff and robotic. "How could you?" she finally whispered, her voice choked with a combination of rage and disbelief. It wasn't a question seeking an answer. It was the cry of a spoiled child who had just had her favorite toy taken away. "How could I?" I repeated, my voice soft but unyielding. "How could I honor your father's true wishes? How could I protect his memory from being turned into a marketing slogan? How could I ensure that his legacy would be one of generosity and not greed? I think the better question, Madison, is how could you not?" She had no answer for that. None of them did. They left without another word. They didn't even take the expensive wine or the glossy brochures. They just stood up, gathered their things, and walked out of the house, out of my life, leaving their catered apple pie uneaten on the table. I watched from the window as the taillights of their car disappeared down the mountain road, a slash of angry red in the gathering twilight. And then, they were gone. I stood alone in the quiet dining room for a long, long time. I didn't feel victorious. I didn't feel triumphant. The anger that had fueled me for weeks had finally burned itself out, leaving behind not emptiness, but a profound sense of peace. The house seemed to breathe a collective sigh of relief, settling back into its own familiar rhythm. I had kept my word. I had honored my love. The next day, the silence felt different. It wasn't the hollow, aching silence of grief anymore. It was a clean, hopeful silence, filled with possibility. I walked through the rooms of my house, touching the things Bob had made, feeling his presence not as a painful absence, but as a warm and steadying force. Late that afternoon, another car crunched up the gravel driveway. But this time, my heart didn't clench with dread. It was my in-laws, Carol, and with her was my granddaughter, Sophia. Sophia, now a bright and lovely 16-year-old with her mother's eyes, ran to me and wrapped me in a fierce hug. "I'm so proud of you, Grandma Ellie," she whispered into my shoulder. Later, while Carol and I sat on the porch with a cup of tea, Sophia wandered off towards the forest, her curiosity pulling her towards the trees. Watching my granddaughter walk the same paths her grandfather loved, I knew I hadn't just won a fight. I had preserved a future. The weeks that followed were filled with a new kind of work. Instead of fighting a battle, I was building a dream. Bob's dream. Mr. Harrison handled the legal and financial paperwork for the new foundation with quiet efficiency. Aunt Carol, true to her word, helped rally community support. Word spread through our small mountain town about the Robert Blackwood Memorial Foundation. People I hadn't seen in years stopped by with offers to help. A retired shop teacher offered to volunteer his time. A local lumberyard donated a supply of starter wood. The goodness of people, I was reminded, was a quiet but powerful force.
Our first project was getting the workshop ready. We cleaned and organized, installed new safety equipment, and put up signs. One crisp autumn Saturday, we held our first official workshop. 3 local teenagers, all of them a bit lost and rough around the edges, showed up, shy and skeptical. I stood by the doorway of the barn,
a place that had once been my husband's solitary sanctuary, and watched as Mr. Henderson, the retired shop teacher, showed a lanky boy named Jake how to properly hold a handsaw. At first, the boy was clumsy and frustrated. But then, after a few tries, he made a clean, straight cut. A slow smile spread across his face, a genuine, unguarded smile of pure accomplishment. In that moment, I heard it. A new sound in the workshop. It was the sound of saws and sandpaper, yes, but underneath it all, there was laughter, there was encouragement, there was purpose. The air was filled not just with the scent of sawdust, but with the scent of hope. This was Bob's legacy, not a silent, sterile monument, but a living, breathing, noisy place of creation and community. That evening, after the workshop was over and the volunteers had gone home, I walked to the edge of the forest as the sun began to set, painting the sky in hues of lavender and gold. The wind whispered through the ancient firs, a sound like a deep, contented sigh. I thought about my own children, Ethan and Madison. I hadn't heard from them since that night. I felt a pang of sadness for them, for the relationship we had lost, for the love they had traded for bitterness. Perhaps one day they would understand, but I knew I couldn't wait for them. My life was here. True inheritance, I realized, isn't found in a bank account or on a property deed. It's not something you can liquidate or leverage. It's the quiet strength, the unwavering integrity, the unspoken promise to tend to what is good and true. It's the values that are passed down, not the valuables. I didn't get revenge on my children. I got something far better. I got to see my husband's spirit live on, not as a brand name on a luxury retreat, but in the grateful silence of a teenager finding purpose, in the protected hush of a forest that would now stand for generations, in the simple, beautiful act of building something good in the world. In the end, I didn't just protect his legacy, I became its guardian. I had protected my husband's legacy, but in doing so, I had found something even more precious, my own. And that's my story. It began with the deepest sorrow of my life and ended with a newfound peace I never thought I'd feel again. It was a fight I never wanted, but one I am so incredibly grateful I had the strength to win, thanks to the love of a good man and the support of a few true allies. I learned that sometimes protecting a legacy means protecting it from the very people who are supposed to be its heirs. It means fighting for the spirit of something, not just its material form. It means choosing purpose over profit every single time. My home is no longer just a house. It's a living tribute to a life well lived. And every day I get to see that life touch others in small but meaningful ways. So I want to turn it back to you, the person listening to this right now. My story is about a will and a piece of land, but the themes are universal. It's about family, about what we value, and about the battles we choose to fight. Have you ever had to stand up for something you believe in, even when it was against the people you love? Have you ever had to fight to protect a memory, a principle, or a promise? It doesn't have to be about a multi-million-dollar estate. It can be about something as small as a promise to a parent, or as big as fighting for your own dignity. Please share your experience in the comments below. Reading your stories, knowing that we are all navigating these complex family dynamics, helps all of us feel a little less alone. Your wisdom and your experiences matter. And if my story touched you today, if it resonated with you in any way, I would be so grateful if you would like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support allows these stories to be told and helps build a community where we can all share and learn from each other. Thank you, from the bottom of my heart, for listening. Be well and be strong.